In the past month, I've been dabbling with fan edits for flawed movies to see if I can snip out some of the more overt problems and rework them into something much better. I did Passengers, Bad Boys 2, and Aliens vs Predator Requiem, some of which I may talk about in another video. Although you can find an excellent breakdown of one of these in Passengers Rearranged by the Nerd Writer. But this one was my most ambitious movie re-edit so far. It made refitting The Hobbit into just 2 movies and removing the superfluous bits of business seem like a light trim. It began with a simple premise with untold complications. I actually really like James Mangold's 2013 film The Wolverine. 3/4 of it is solid and it's only the last half hour where things get shaky. But just cutting that out felt like missing an opportunity, so I thought bigger. My remit was to re-envision Wolverine's story prior to Logan into one single movie that forms a solid companion piece, explores his history, and is somehow coherent, thus resulting in a pair of really truly great Wolverine films, honouring the hard work that went into The Wolverine, but also some of Jackman and his co-stars' best work in the previous films. So here's what I had to work with. X-Men, X-Men 2 Mutants United, X-Men 3 The Last Stand, X-Men Origins Wolverine, and The Wolverine. 5 movies, none of them wholly brilliant, all of them containing a piece of the puzzle. My edit of this film, which I'm simply calling Wolverine, begins with the 1945 bombing of Nagasaki from the beginning of Mangold's The Wolverine. It's a great starting point and it comes into play later on. The whole second half of this project is also mostly this film, since the serious direction ties in neatly with Logan. I also rendered all of the movies into black and white to put across a more adult tone and distract with bright comic book colours less. It also makes the different directors and cinematographers less apparent, unifying 5 similar but still different filmic looks. I hadn't banked on the 5 composers, Harry Gregson Williams, Michael Kamen, John Ottman, John Powell and Marco Beltrami, giving it 5 different musical flavours, but it's actually pretty good for separating scenes out and showing the passage of time. I cut sharply at the point Logan is horribly burned in the nuclear fire. Four minutes in, and Logan wakes up in the Canadian mountains in 1979. It's one of the earlier scenes in X-Men Origins Wolverine. I originally started with the opening on the Howlett estate, followed by the action-packed historical montage, but I decided to skip over it for a reason I will go into later. An additional reason was to focus on Victor Creed as a fixture in Logan's life, which of course I couldn't follow up on, as I also cut out the whole horrible Team X section, so no crappy Wade Wilson non-starter and the rest of that vestigial garbage. Logan wakes up from a nightmare of burning down the well, and Kayla comforts him. He lives in the country, a man at peace. Stryker comes to see him to warn him about Creed. I cut out a little bit of the cockfighting with Agent Zero. He sends Stryker away and Kayla tells him her Wolverine story, which I have always kind of liked, although I can understand why many people don't. The next section has Kayla encounter Creed and Logan finds her dead, howling at the sky, but without that awful crane shot that makes the scene trite. He fights with Stryker at the hospital with less ponderous exposition and goes to confront Creed. Their physical clash is really pretty meaty and savage in black and white. Logan gets his bone claws broken and naturally agrees to the Weapon X adamantium implant process, which, again, has a lot less of Stryker's evil, gloating machinations. What is made clear here is the dual nature, the animal and the man. He escapes and takes refuge in the farm of Heather and Tom Hudson, though without the horrible CG claws and comedy bathroom trashing. Then in the barn they kindly give him their son's jacket and motorbike. Then they're shot dead. This scene, if you've watched Logan, now obviously has special significance. I removed Agent Zero sniping and in fact cut out the rest of the film because it's mostly goofy action, adamantium bullets and Deadpool stand-ins. This also means that Kayla really did just die. There's no duplicity plot, although I didn't want to directly contradict the X-Men movies if I could help it, mostly because their storylines are stuck in my head and everybody else's, but that didn't mean I couldn't refocus. So the events could have played out the same way as in the film, we just didn't see them, kind of like how the hobbits turn up in Bree with no mention of Tom Bombadil. The helicopter destroys the barn and we cut back to Logan in flames, screaming down the well, again with Yoshida, whom he has just protected, unlike the Hudsons. He wakes up and an unseen woman asks him where he was. This all plays in with Logan's brain being Swiss cheesed by healing over details of traumatic memories and rearranging important figures for him to confront. Logan's brain wants him to understand, but it's at war with his healing factor. 28 minutes in and we cut to Rogue getting off at the truck stop she will meet Logan at in the original X-Men, 24 years after Weapon X, although I don't actually say any of this with subtitles because Charles is about to say it was 15 years. This is because they never planned any of this shit, but it does actually play into the sense of being time displaced that Logan goes through. Arrival was an influence here. Logan finds Rogue after the bar altercation where he is still wearing the Hudson's jacket. They get a little more acquainted and then Sabretooth interrupts them. Since we just saw the Creed fight as well as Wolverine smelling Creed both times before he appears, and because there's no zooming in on Tyler Mane at this point, it just looks like Creed has given in to his animal side, which has a greater ramification on Logan trying so hard to remain a man. I also tried cutting Sabretooth out entirely, but if Logan and Rogue crash the truck and the X-Men immediately rescue them, it looks like they caused the crash. It is a fight from this point on not to make it look like a creepy Heaven's Gate cult. Interestingly, with Charles explaining the school and the cause of mutant freedom to Logan, we experience a sudden sense of potential place and purpose for him. It is so much more impactful if we've seen his former life here than if you just start with X-Men 1. I cut out the bit where he says, "Why do they call you Wheels?" to Charles because it makes him look like a piece of shit. The next scene involves Logan being inspected by Jean and shown to his room. He flirts with her and Scott acts all possessive. No Magneto, no Senator Kelly or any of that stuff required. Mystique is not in this film at all. Wolverine is disturbed in his sleep by Rogue, in the middle of what is now clearly a pattern of nightmares brought on by post-traumatic stress disorder. The stuff Fox said people wouldn't want to see. Logan accidentally stabs Rogue and she uses his powers to heal herself. Charles and Cyclops talk, Rogue leaves, though we never see Mystique pretending to be Bobby shooing her away, so it's only because of the nighttime incident, as Logan surmises. Charles uses Cerebro to track Rogue to the train station, and we cut to Wolverine sitting down with her to talk. No Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, no Magneto. He convinces her to give these geeks another chance, and this is significant because after all this time he has found a place he wants to call home to. 56 minutes in we cut to sometime in the near future, and it's the Days of Future Past training session from the beginning of X-Men 3. That's right. Nothing in the rest of X-Men or the entirety of X-Men 2 is of any real significance here. I know, sacrilege. It's all just messing around and Wolverine doesn't learn a damn thing. The big mystery of his past is never really revealed in X2, and we've already seen everything important that could be connected to these posed questions as to what they did and why he volunteered. All that gets cemented is that he wants to stay an X-Man, which was already established on the train. So that's what he is now, and what he has been for a while, as is apparent from the Sentinel takedown, which also shows Rogue working with the team. I even snuck in a few Colossus lines from Deadpool for grins, thus making his character Russian and more consistent across the series than Fox managed. Because if you ever listen to him, he's like, "Hey, how's it going, Logan?" He's totally American, as opposed to Your Drowning Pool is best soundtrack. So how the hell do I explain Jean's death and the Phoenix in order to link it back to the Wolverine? This was the trickiest part because they mangled the Phoenix saga with pretty much every word and every frame of this third film, which is one of my most hated films of all time, I might add. It's just so stupid and wrong-headed and ill-considered, especially when Charles explains glibly that he basically caused this by locking off bits of her brain, despite the fact that if anyone should know the dangers and ethical freefall that this represents, it's Charles. If the focus of X-Men 3 had been on his mistakes, on his anger, his regret, his weakness, how this inspiring leader was just a fallible man, it actually would have made a brilliant precursor to the Charles we see in Logan. But as you know, regrettably, it did not. So after the Danger Room, we actually cut back to the beginning of X2, although we don't know that if we haven't seen any of these films. It's just Jean and Cyclops, and she's got a new haircut. Jean's having a serious episode in the museum. Scott says that he will never let anything happen to her. We know that these words, despite his conviction, do not in any way represent any ability to stop what's coming. Immediately, cut to the point in X3 when Charles and everyone else in the museum suffers a psychic attack. This is where Jean, as Phoenix, is disintegrating Scott beside Alkali Lake, but as Logan and Aurora run in slow motion to Charles's office, he never tells them to go. Lisa Gerrard is singing Gloradin from Heat, and the slow-mo continues to the scene where Charles tells Logan what has occurred. It's all visual, as the clumsy words he says, including something about the sheer force of water, which would take far too long to get set up, are replaced by this mournful, powerful song. As far as we, the audience, are concerned, Jean never died and was never reborn, but she did suffer a serious psychic breakdown as her powers went haywire, hurting everyone, and showing already how dangerous she is. But you can also still paint in the original events of the X-Men 2 and 3 films if you want. Fade to black as Logan waits by her bedside. Her hair is now long, indicating she has been here in a coma for a long while. She wakes up as Jean and they talk quietly, which escalates into a passionate makeout session with Phoenix, minus the ludicrous moment where she telekinetically yanks off his belt. It just looks silly. She overpowers him and he rejects her, causing an explosive outburst. Then, during the resultant chaos, you see a super fast clip of the fight on Alcatraz Island, culminating in only the two of them being left. Wolverine pushes against this force exuding from Jean, his skin being torn off and reforming until he reaches her. She begs him to save her, and he does so with his claws. I wish this was a different scenario, but it's what the Wolverine is contingent upon. His blaming himself for this moment, a choice that effectively his hand was forced on. She dies in his arms, and we pan up in the dark. This is a vastly abbreviated X-Men 3, but there's no other way to show it without letting these awful versions of the characters speak. On a side note, X-Men 3 looks much better in black and white. They used a good camera and kept it in focus with a nice, clear contrast. 67 minutes in. Now, before we move on to The Wolverine, which happens nearly a decade later in chronology, I need to show the effects of having to leave the X-Men behind, because the third film ends happily with a nice, comforting pan away from the mansion for closure. So since I really wish the Johnny Cash song Hurt had actually been in Logan, along with flashes from the 6.5 unused hours of the previous movies. While it can't have the impact of that amazing Logan trailer, what I did here is probably the best part of this edit, and I put this section on YouTube on its own, although just watching it alone is out of context with the rest of the edit on this film. Because I never showed Logan leaving the mansion behind at the end of the first movie and bidding goodbye to Rogue, that happens here. Since he begins the Wolverine in rural Canada, that's the bit at the opening of X2 that I show, and my personal favourite touch, when Cash says that he remembers everything, that's where I include the war montage from the beginning of Origins, minus the freeze frames and credits on screen. Taylor Kitsch as Gambit is not appearing in this film, and with only minor shots of Creed. We see Rogue, Charles, Kayla, and Jean as the people important to Logan, as well as his parents. And when Cash says, "If I could start again a million miles away," that's when young James Howlett makes his appearance, unimpaling his biological father and moving in reverse to sheath his tiny new claws. The original by Mark Romanek, the editorial style of which I emulated closely, has always been at the top of my list of favourite music videos. It made me very emotional to watch, and I hope it does the same for others. "70 minutes in, and from this part onward, the second half is all The Wolverine, with a few important tweaks. All talks of transferring Logan's abilities to another person is gone, because I want to preserve the idea that Yoshida is an honourable man, not a crazy old git who wants to live forever, #Prometheus. Viper is barely in it, as she no longer needs to be the penultimate boss, and she just spends the whole time spitting in everyone's face anyway. And the last quarter is gone entirely. The man behind the takeover bid is thus Shingen, Yoshida's son. He kidnaps Mariko, his own daughter. There are no ninjas and no silver samurai suit trying to suck out Logan's juice. And the film retains its serious tone. This does, however, mean that a very important moment of moving on is missing, because Logan says goodbye to Jean and forgives himself at the very end. I have now moved this to the point where Logan apparently dies on the table, having cut his own chest open to retrieve the parasitic machine, while a kick-ass Yukio is fighting off Shingen. He comes back to life out of the White Room just in time to prevent her untimely death, and she becomes his new companion and support, someone he can teach and protect who can do the same for him, which of course leads us on to Logan. I even reinserted the deleted scene with the gift of the outlandish Wolverine costume, which hints at the pull back towards superheroics. The way the movie is cut, the X-Men were a relatively short period in his life, but it was a period that meant something good. It was a positive use of his abilities, which kinda makes how that turns out even sadder. There's no airport stinger scene because Charles was never disintegrated and Eric was never depowered, and what they say has no bearing on the Logan movie. Days of Future Past with its time travel deserves its own separate edit, as I'd like to bring it into line as a sequel to First Class, featuring a time-displaced and thus different to this one, Wolverine, which basically entails cutting out as much of the future stuff with the non-speaking zero-agency fireworks display mutants as possible. That also means, for those keeping track of my multiple universe theory, that this Wolverine film and Logan are Universe A, despite what the official timeline now says, and First Class and this potential Days of Future Past edit are Universe B. Universe C, basically everything that follows on from the end of Days of Future Past, is X-Men Apocalypse, so it can be left entirely alone. There's no saving that film, and First Class and Deadpool are perfect just the way they are. This will, of course, have to change at some point soon when the new X-Men movies come out. The end credits of Wolverine I wanted to be special too, so I recruited Johnny Cash again, this time singing his cover of Bridge Over Troubled Waters, which brings in Fiona Apple for a surprisingly tender duet, perfect for the hopeful tone at the close as he bids goodbye to one brave, smart woman that he's made a respected friend of, and who has survived her encounter with him as he departs with another. It runs a total of 2 hours and 38 minutes, and watching it feels like The Godfather Part 2 of Wolverine films. It jumps about quite a bit in the first half and settles for the second, but the themes are clear. A man who is alone and tormented, afraid that getting close to people will result in their deaths, haunted by dreams of violence, and seeking some redemption and peace. It reminded my wife most of all of The Winter Soldier. Paired with Logan, especially Logan Noir, the two together should, I hope, tell the story of a lost man and the home he finds in other people. There's nowhere near enough Charles in my version of Wolverine, but pretty much everything significant of this on-screen pairing is actually in there, which is a damning indictment of what a wasted opportunity these earlier X-Men films were at keeping the two best realised roles together. I do believe that in better hands the wonderful Ian McKellen, one of my all-time favourite people, could have been an amazing, consistent and understandable Magneto rather than the smug, hypocritical Bond villain and occasionally Hitler he was relegated to. Dude tries to kill the entire human race at the end of X2, don't say he's not Hitler. But this Wolverine edit highlights pretty much every important, serious moment of amazingly potent on-screen presence that Hugh Jackman delivered in these 5 flawed films. It's heavier on the drama than the action, but when he does fight, specifically in the Wolverine section, it is brutal and deadly. So let me know in the comments what other films I could turn my hand to, and be sure to explain what you'd like to see changed about them and why this will work. One that I've been thinking of doing is boiling down both parts of Mockingjay to see if there's a film as good as the first 2 Hunger Games movies in there. I did think about Suicide Squad, but I'm not a sorcerer. I just have sharp editing claws. Snicked. Bub.